Again, this is being done by the public healthcare system of Canada, okay? This has either federal or provincial oversight. This is the federal government or the provincial governments of Canada being complicit, yes, complicit in genocide, okay? There is no other way to describe this. I am not being hyperbolic when I describe it this way. We're doing this.
News out of Cowessess First Nation, where they say they've found hundreds of unmarked graves at the former Maryvale Indian Residential School site. While we don't know exact numbers yet, the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations says this discovery is the most substantial to date in Canada. The school operated for nearly 100 years, closing its doors in 1997. The site is now located on Cowessess First Nation, about 2 hours east of Regina. The First Nation teamed up with Saskatchewan Polytechnic using ground-penetrating radar to search.
All right, so I've reported on this pretty extensively so far. I'm going to continue to do so. It's obviously incredibly disturbing and horrifying. There's, again, 139 residential schools in Canada, so this is 2 of the residential schools that have had this satellite technology investigate the grounds and find that, yes, there are mass graves of children buried underneath, murdered kids. This one, over 750 murdered kids. Every single one of these schools most likely has mass graves with murdered children underneath. Thousands and thousands of murdered kids are basically making up the very ground of Canadian soil that this country is based on.
Search its community gravesite. Earlier this month, Cowessess Chief Cadmus Delorme said 2/3 of those graves were unmarked, and he wasn't sure what they'd find in the search. In a tweet, Assembly of First Nations National Chief Perry Bellegarde called the news absolutely tragic but not surprising, urging Canadians to stand with First Nations in this extremely difficult and emotional time. Premier Scott Moe says he's reached out to both the FSIN and Cowessess chiefs, offering full support from the provincial.
Were these run by religious orders? So basically what this was initially run by the Catholic Church of Canada back when Canada was basically unifying itself under John A. Macdonald. And then it got taken over by the federal government. So the government of Canada actually started running these torture chambers themselves. And it's horrifying and it's shaking the country to its core. I am going to mass tweet again the link to the 24/7 residential school support number if you don't already know it and you have friends or family who are Indigenous and who are contemplating suicide. Here's a link to the number to call. It runs 24/7.
Provincial government recognizing more communities will feel the same shock and despair as these searches continue across the province. We're expected to learn more later this morning when the FSIN and Cowessess First Nation host a press conference at 9 a.m. local time.
So they held their press conference. This was just a quick summary of it.
The Roman Catholic Church and the Oblates arrived on Cowessess First Nation. And that is when the gravesite began. In 1898, the Maryvale Residential School opened its doors, and it closed its doors in 1996. The Roman Catholic Church overseen the gravesite. The Catholics and the prayer and religion overseen the gravesite. We started our radar penetrating research on June the 2nd of 2021. As of yesterday, we have hit 751 unmarked graves. This is not a mass grave site. These are unmarked graves. Over the past years, the oral stories of our elders, of our survivors, and friends of our survivors have told the stories that knew these burials were here. In 1960, there may have been marks on these graves. The Catholic Church representatives removed these headstones, and today they are unmarked graves. At this time, I'm just going to share my screen so you have a visual of what we're talking about. You're going to notice that there are flags, and I apologize, it might be a little tough to see. But this is now today on Cowessess First Nation, and this is what we call today our community gravesite. It became our community gravesite after the 1970s, when the residential school was stopped, overseen by the Roman Catholic Church and the Archdiocese. We also wanted to show you a little more of a visual from a drone perspective. Of the 751 hits, the machine has a 10 to 15% error percentage. So we will only go by the hits that we have of 700.
So to answer a couple of questions in chat, first off, one of the reasons why they would unmark the gravestones was, again, to continue erasing their cultural history, their names, their lives, even in death, which is pretty fucking morbid. The other thing is, why are they dead? A handful of reasons. Some of them would have died from diseases. Some of them would have died from torture. Some of them would have died from being murdered. Some of them would have died from rape and the trauma experience from that. Some of them would have died from suicide. Every single death, though, is a murder. Because, again, these kids were taken from their families and forced to be in these schools. So that puts them under the supervision of the government of Canada. And if they died under that supervision, then they were killed effectively by the government of Canada.
51, but we do know there's at least 600. You're going to notice that they are in proper order. These that lay here are 1 meter by 1 meter apart in some cases.
We don't know if they're going to be exhumed yet. That would be a monstrously expensive undertaking, one that should be 100% paid for by the government of Canada. As of right now, the only commitments that have been made are to continue to use this technology to try and discover more grave sites. But I think it's absolutely the right thing to do to be able to identify these families, these family members for the Indigenous families themselves, most of whom were told that their kids ran away, not that their kids died and are being buried in mass grave sites near the schools themselves. Like, that's such a fucked up thing. Like, this is, like I said, Nazi shit. Because, again, like, they're killed and murdered, and they're buried in mass graves near the school itself.
Cases, we cannot affirm that they are all children, but there are oral stories that there are adults in this gravesite as well, because it was the Roman Catholic Church that overseen this gravesite.
Antifa, my boyfriend's father was part of the 60s coup. I cannot thank you enough for this coverage. Oh, wow. So he's the legacy of a survivor. That's wild. How's he doing? How's he holding up with all this news?
May have went to the church and from our local towns, and they could have been buried here as well. This could be triggering to many, but when you're from Cowessess First Nation, or you have attended the Merivale Residential School, which many have in southern Saskatchewan and Manitoba, we always knew that there was graves here.
That's also where my mom's band is from. That's where her Métis family is from, is Saskatchewan.
The recent story of the Kamloops Residential School has triggered many in this country, and we knew this was going to trigger as well. There are many agree to disagree from Cowessess on the history of this gravesite. But I want to affirm to you, we are talking about unmarked graves. We're not talking about a mass gravesite. Today in this country, First Nations people, and this instant Cowessess, we've never ever swayed away from who we are as a Nehewak and Anishinaabe people. The Roman Catholic Residential School has impacted us intensely. And today we have generations that may have not went to residential school, but they are feeling the first and second generation of that impact. All we ask of all of you listening is that you stand by us as we heal and we get stronger, and that we all must put down our ignorance and accidental racism of not addressing the truth that this country has with Indigenous people. We are not asking for pity, but we are asking for understanding. We need time to heal, and this country must stand by us. We have reached out to the Government of Canada. The Prime Minister, Minister Bennett, Minister Miller have reached out and told us that they stand beside us in what they can help with today. I have reached out, and they have reached out to me, the Roman Catholic Church, our archdiocese in this region. His name is Don, and we have talked as well. What we are going to be doing now is we are going to be putting names to these unmarked graves. We want to honor our loved ones that lay there today. We want to make sure that we keep that place and preserve it so many could come here and heal. It's going to hurt in the coming months because the more we put names to them, the more that it is going.
So for people asking about the Catholic Church as well, the government of Canada has done the Spider-Man meme where they're basically trying to point the finger at the Catholic Church, where both are complicit. And the Catholic Church has offered a very half-assed, not even a real apology, where the Pope basically said, "We understand your sorrow and our heart and plight goes out to Canadians suffering," which is kind of rich because I was like, it's the Canadians who did this. But the Catholic Church 100% would have records of not only the priests and nuns who committed all these atrocities, including murders and rapes, but also records of the children themselves, as well as a lot of crucial information. But they have refused to release any of it.
Going to reopen some of the pains that many endured at the Maryville Residential School are going to reopen. The gravesite is there and it's real. And if you were to see it, there are 751 flags when you look at it. It is the pain of the memories of being in the school for many that it is triggering. And that's why I thank all of the messages, everyone listening, that I ask you to open your mind that this country needs to have truth and reconciliation. There's going to be many more stories in the future, and this is Cowes' First Nations.
Yeah, there's going to be, like I said, 137 more of these. Every single politician has come out and given, half-assed statements, especially Trudeau, which is just fucking grim considering that, like, he's actively fighting residential school survivors in court. He's spent more money than his predecessor, the conservative Stephen Harper. He's spent over $100 million battling them in court. I think the only person worth his salt, honestly, so far has been Jagmeet Singh in his response. This was the one he made to the original Kamloops residential school.
I also wanted to ask you what your message is to the families who lost loved ones in residential schools who, as a result of this sort of renewed spotlight on looking for these burial sites, finally have some hope that they might find closure.
What accountability is possible? Quite a bit. I don't know the statute of limitations in Canada, so I can't speak about that right now. But there's a lot of individuals, especially Catholic priests and nuns, who are directly responsible for, again, raping and murdering kids, which I think they should be held accountable for everything they've done. There's a lot of RCMP officers who should be held accountable for taking the kids from their families and putting them in these schools. There's a lot of politicians who should be held accountable for systemically allowing this entire organization to operate in this way, as well as those who have been covering it up. Every single person. There's literally thousands of individuals who are guilty of crime in this scenario. In terms of realistic, like, none of that is going to happen. Let's just be completely frank about this. In terms of actual accountability, first off, stop fighting residential school survivors in court. Give them their reparations. Give them all of their reparations. Secondly, land back. Honor the treaties that were made with Indigenous communities and allow them to have sovereign control over their own land, and also aid them. There's a wonderful program that was established to give Indigenous kids in Canada tons and tons of funding in order to help uplift their current crisis. And that again was battled in court by the Trudeau government. Luckily, the Supreme Court of Canada struck that down, and Indigenous children are going to be getting billions of dollars from the federal government, which is a beautiful thing. That's what should happen. There's nothing that has been proven better to aid Indigenous communities, and I will argue that you could probably make a very fair comparison to the Black communities of America. Should you do this? Then investing in children, investing in their like homes, investing in their communities, investing in their schools, investing in their healthcare, in their welfare. All that stuff is the time-honored and tested best method for improving the conditions of their lives today, compared to simply giving large swaths of money to tribal leaders. And I know that one is very controversial because there is large amounts of money that is usually given to tribal leaders in Canada, but there's a ton of controversy surrounding that as well, how the money is appropriated, how it's used. I think the best method for aiding Indigenous people is to invest in their children, to be totally honest.
Do you have any message for those individuals?
I'm sorry. We're going to fight for justice for you.
Thank you.
Yeah, he's sick. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much the only response you can give. Oof. Crown Indigenous Minister Carolyn Bennett apologizes for message that MP Jody Wilson-Raybould calls racist and misogynistic. If you don't know, Jody Wilson-Raybould was originally a Liberal MP. She's Indigenous. She was elected and then left the Liberal Party after the scandal came out, in which she was basically the whistleblower. She's been a pretty amazing independent MP since then. Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett apologized to Jody Wilson-Raybould on Thursday after sending her a text message suggesting that Wilson-Raybould doesn't want a federal election because it would imperil her pension, a charge that Indigenous MPs described as racist and misogynistic. Wilson-Raybould, who served as Canada's first Indigenous Attorney General before being expelled from the Liberal caucus, tweeted a screenshot of a text conversation with the minister in which Bennett referred to one of Wilson-Raybould's tweets regarding the discovery of hundreds of unmarked graves at a site of former residential schools in Saskatchewan. With the horrific news out of Saskatchewan, our collective call again is for concrete transformative action. Justin Trudeau, if you care enough to make things right, you'll stop selfish jockeying for an election, which no one really wants, and to do what you promised in 2018. Bennett said Wilson-Raybould a screenshot of the tweet along with the word pension ? Fucking ghoulish shit. If a federal election is called after October 19th, Wilson-Raybould and other MPs first elected in 2015 will be eligible for an annual pension starting at $32,000, which begins at age 65. MPs must contribute to the plan for at least 6 years before the pension can be claimed. If an election is called before that date, parliamentarians need to be re-elected to receive it. Less than 2 hours after Wilson-Raybould posted a screenshot, Chief Cadmus DeLorme of the Cowessess First Nation confirmed that 751 graves had been found on the grounds of former Maryville Indian Residential School. Bennett apologized after Wilson-Raybould shared the text, which independent MPs called racist and misogynistic, and said it reflects the notion that Indigenous people are lazy and only want money. The tweet by the Federal Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations shows disregard, disdain, and disrespect for Indigenous people and conveys a message that strong Indigenous women are bad, Wilson-Raybould wrote on Twitter. Bennett said she apologized directly to Vancouver Granville MP. I let interpersonal dynamics get the better of me and sent an insensitive and inappropriate comment, which I deeply regret and shouldn't have done. Bennett has previously said that no relationship is more important to the federal government than the one with Indigenous peoples. The year that I voted for Justin Trudeau, which you can't actually vote for Justin Trudeau unless he happens to be in your riding. You actually vote for your local MP, and then enough of those MPs form together, and they form a little cohesive blob, and then that blob gives the Prime Minister his power. That's how parliamentary systems work. It's blob politics, basically. But I ended up voting for Jody Wilson-Raybould when she was a Liberal MP. That's the only time I've voted Liberal, and I'm actually pretty happy to see how that turned out because she's independent now and is still kind of crushing it. So that's good. Anyways, it's a deeply tragic story. Again, I'm going to share the link for the 24/7 suicide prevention line. If you happen to know any Indigenous people who could be suffering at this time, please give them the link. It's 24/7. and it could definitely go a long way to helping them. This again is one of over 100 schools. We've now had 2 which have used satellite imagery to uncover the fact that there's multiple bodies of children buried underneath them. And yeah, there's going to be hundreds and hundreds more, and it's going to be horrifying, and it's going to be dark, and it's really unfortunate.
The next day.
All right, everyone. We got a whole bunch of drama to quickly go over. It's going to be a fun time, and it's going to be great. You're going to love this segment. It's going to be some high-level ideas. That's right. Yeah. So, as you probably know, I have been covering the treatment of Indigenous people by the Canadian government for some time, speaking about the atrocities committed therein, and of course the ongoing genocide of the Indigenous people in this country. And I have faced a number of, let's just say, conflicting battles online as a result of doing so. I didn't think I'd be doing this arc, where I'm going to be talking about Destiny, Bastiat, and a whole bunch of other streamers who have taken quite a bit of offense to me calling the actions of the Canadian government a genocide, or constituting a genocide. And that, again, is, I guess, a pretty heavy-loaded word and or term that has been used online for a variety of reasons. I will go to this little Twitter battle that's been happening to kind of start this and explain the arc that's been happening. Now, I don't want to disavow any of the tweets that are made on the behalf of the other people who run our Twitter account. We do have 2 of us that are tweeting on a regular basis, and we're tweeting fast and furious to a fault. We do make bad tweets. I try to delete the bad tweets, as does Dave, when bad tweets are made. But I do take responsibility for everything that is on the Serfs Twitter account. So I'm not going to throw anyone under the bus right now. But I'm going to say that there was a bad tweet made. And it came under this when I was speaking about how China is trying to call out Canada for its cultural genocide. I said both of them are committing cultural genocide, at which point someone responded, China isn't committing genocide, though. So then this was going to be a battle of semantics. And this was a bad tweet that I subsequently deleted, looking to specify it's cultural genocide, but yeah, Twitter will misinterpret that, so I'll delete it. Destiny took a lot of offense to this, calling what China is doing to the Uyghur people a cultural genocide, rather than just flat out calling it a genocide. And thus, this arc began. So I retweeted this right away, saying that China and Canada are committing genocide. It doesn't matter if it's cultural genocide. Genocide is genocide. That's all there is to this. And just getting lost in the weeds of the semantics argument when it comes to this is a foolish thing. If we look to the Wikipedia Andes of what is cultural genocide, genocide is the denial of the right of existence of an entire human group, as homicide is the denial of rights to live with individual human beings, such as the denial of the right of existence shocks the conscience of mankind, results in great losses to humanity in the form of cultural and other contributions represented by these human groups, and is contrary to moral law and the spirit of aims of the United Nations. Many instances of such crimes of genocide have occurred when racial, religious, and political and other groups have been destroyed entirely or in part. So, adopted from the UN General Assembly, comes the actual definition of genocide that is used by the International Criminal Court. Any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. A. Killing members of the group. B. Causing seriously bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. E. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. E especially is one that Canada has a whole bunch of fucking crimes and blood upon its hands. However, they fit, in my opinion, the definition of many of these. I didn't think this was a matter of debate, that Canada has not only committed genocide, but that the genocide is ongoing. I was wrong. This became a very big back and forth and has continued right now between me and Destiny. And we can stop saying Destiny's friend. Like, what the fuck are we talking about? Talking about China versus Western country. LOL. Again, really upset by me using the term cultural genocide. China and Canada are committing genocide. LOL. Then another one. What proof is there of an ongoing genocide in Canada right now? I then wrote, there's two big links. Can you demonstrate how there is an ongoing genocide in Canada against Indigenous people? Still waiting for that. Clearly did not read either the links that I provided. But yeah, we're still going back and forth. And then, of course, everyone who is within Destiny's purview started thinking that this was a great time to throw their hat in the ring. And that brings in Bastiat. The United States must act at once to stop the ongoing genocide in Canada. If the Trudeau regime will not stop committing genocide, we must use military force to end the genocide as soon as possible. Never again must mean never again. And then, of course, you know, this old picture here. There's a lot of context in which I would find this joke funny, especially the idea of invading Canada for its oil resources, which is something the US has a tendency to do. In the grounds of what we're talking about here, it's kind of morally reprehensible because, again, this isn't really like open, fertile ground for comedy. Like, I don't know what you would do for a follow-up. Are you going to break out the Holocaust jokes next? Because again, this shit is absolutely horrifying. And this was all happening, by the way, on the day of yet another discovery of mass graves in Canada. 715 kids buried in yet another residential school graveyard. So, again, you know, people are going to say that I'm clutching pearls, that I'm virtue signaling, that being outraged by any of this is simply a performative act. So, to which I would respond, yikes, like just big old yikes. And then again, we went back and forth a handful of times. Both Bastiat and Destiny say that there's absolutely no evidence to constitute that this is happening. You claim that China and Canada are currently committing genocide. China is committing genocide. Canada is not. Comparing Canada to China as if it's conterminous or comparable is wrong and does nothing but give cover to what the Chinese Communist Party is now doing in Xinjiang. So we've got ourselves the big old case of China's committing genocide. Canada is not. Canada's doing a great old job. So don't be upset about any of this. Again, this is happening as we are discovering more and more unmarked graves of children who were mass buried around numerous residential schools in Canada. If you haven't followed any of my videos on this topic, I can provide links to them. But I've done a pretty extensive coverage of the fact that the residential school system in Canada, which was originally run by the Catholic Church and eventually was taken over by the federal government of Canada, of which there is 139 federally overseen residential schools in the country, not to mention hundreds of provincial ones as well, was one of the darkest and most horrifying parts of Canadian history, in which, again, children were taken from their mother's arms, forcibly put into these schools, where they were tortured, raped, and murdered systemically, under the supervision of the Canadian government, which is 100% genocide. There's just no other way to describe it. I don't think it's me using the term flippantly. I don't think it's me downplaying the severity of using that expression.
Mississauga Church has been defaced following highly controversial comments made about residential schools Sunday. Monsignor Owen Keenan told his parish that 2/3 of the country blames the church for the tragedies that occurred in residential schools, and then went on to suggest that others would thank the church
for the good that was done in those schools. But of course, that question was never asked. And in fact, we're not allowed even to say that good was done in those schools.
See, this is one of the most horrifying things and why I say that this is ongoing. It's this mental state that people have that this was done with the best of intentions. I mean, yes, kids were raped and murdered and tortured, but we had good intentions. You know, the whole purpose of this was ultimately to, again, remove the Indian from within, which was the exact quote of what they stated their intention and purpose was. I have the actual document here in case anyone thinks, again, that I'm being flippant about this. The goal of residential schools: we instill in them a pronounced distaste for the native life so that they will be humiliated when reminded of their origin. When they graduate from our institutions, the children have lost everything native except their blood. Bishop Vital Grandin. Now, I'm not sure if everyone here knows who Robert Pickton is. If you haven't, it's the largest and most prolific serial killer in Canadian history. Robert Pickton owned a pig farm in British Columbia. In that pig farm, he would abduct numerous Indigenous women to the tune of, he claims to have murdered 46 of them. I believe he was charged with 14, but he would abduct Indigenous women, sex workers, and murder them after raping them, at which point he would feed them to his pigs. If that's the first time you've heard about this story, it again is incredibly dark, it's incredibly fucked up, and the reason I bring it up is because this is one of many cases of Indigenous women being abducted in this country, which continues until now. It continues until this day. The murder of Indigenous women in this country is a national tragedy. We're talking thousands upon thousands of Indigenous women are murdered and missing in this country. It's such a monstrously huge phenomenon, and it's continuing to this day, that we had to launch a national inquiry into it to discover the lengths of depravity and to how far this goes, and why the police, why the RCMP of this country have refused to investigate it. Because again, they don't give a fuck.
Another man is listed as the author, but the book is the work and the words of Robert William Pickton, Canada's deadliest serial killer, a former pig farmer who's in a maximum security prison in BC. He was convicted of killing 6 women, but confessed to killing 49. The back cover calls him the Fall Guy, and indeed, in 144 rambling pages, Pickton does proclaim his innocence. Victims' families are outraged. Sandra Gagnon's sister, Janet Henry, used to frequent Pickton's farm and went missing in 1997.
It really disgusts me knowing that the worst serial killer in Canadian history has the nerve to write that book and reopen wounds.
So how did Pickton get a book published? CTV is reporting Pickton had the manuscript smuggled out of prison by a former cellmate who gave it to a friend who apparently used a self-publishing website. From there, it's an easy jump to online booksellers, both in the U.S. and Canada.
How can they write books when they're supposed to be doing time for something so brutal?
Last fall, there was an uproar when serial killer Paul Bernardo published a novel online. It was quickly...
Oh, Soy King, I'll explain. Because a lot of the problem here is a lot of people think this is like some dark piece of our like ancient history. And now everything's cool. Everything's gone to normal. Like, it's as if, and I'm starting to get this feeling, that the Liberals like assume Justin Trudeau wakes up every morning, gets out of bed, and is like, now, what ways can I commit more genocide against Indigenous people today? Here's my next act. And then that would constitute genocide. But if he's not doing that, I mean, this is just fucked up shit by a lot of fucked up actors. None of this is actually systemic. And at the end of the day, he's gone a very long way to try and improve things, right? Now, I do want to give credit where credit is due when it comes to Justin Trudeau. When he came to power, I believe back in 2005, one of the first things he did is he launched the inquiry. And it's a historic inquiry. I'm going to read it out to you. If anyone doesn't know about this. Canada is complicit in race-based genocide against Indigenous women, a government inquiry has found. The report cited research finding Indigenous women were 12 times more likely to be killed or disappear than other women in Canada. The inquiry blamed the crisis on deep-rooted colonialism and state inaction. Amongst more than 200 recommendations is a call for all Canadians to help end violence, including by learning Indigenous history. The 1,200-page document released on Monday is the culmination of almost 3 years of hearing and research by the inquiry into the disproportionate violence faced against Indigenous women and girls in Canada. Despite their differences in circumstances and backgrounds, all of the missing and murdered are connected by economic, social, and political marginalization, racism, and misogyny woven into the fabric of Canadian society. It cost $92 million and was heard by more than 2,000 witnesses since 2017, including survivors and violence and family members. Mr. Trudeau's government launched the inquiry in late of September 2016 after years of calls by one Indigenous and international organization. Notable cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls has fueled a call for a national inquiry, including the Vancouver murders by by Robert Pickton and the death of schoolgirl Tina Fontaine. In 2015, a landmark Truth and Reconciliation Commission report into the legacy of residential schools in Canada issued a damning verdict that the policy amounted to cultural genocide. Monday's document takes the finding a step further, saying that the murder and disappearance of Indigenous women and girls over the past few decades has amounted to a race-based genocide of Indigenous peoples. The report found that persistent and deliberate human and Indigenous rights violations and abuses are the root cause behind Canada's staggering rates of violence. Past inquiries and investigations into Canada, including the 1996 Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples to the more recent Truth and Reconciliation report, have put forward 900 wide-ranging recommendations to deal with many of these underlying issues. Many have never been applied. This is one of the most important parts. The own investigation by our government found that, yes, we are not only having atrocities in our history, that we are currently committing them. This is an ongoing issue. This has not stopped. This is the most important fundamental fucking part of all this, and why this fucking gets me so upset to see so many people saying that this is all over. It is not. There is multiple recommendations that have been put forth by the government of Canada that have not been followed through in order to try and stop this, in order to try and again halt the ongoing genocide of Indigenous people in this country. This is a problem that keeps on happening. Women are still being abducted across the streets, and they are not being cared for. The conditions in reserves in Canada are still deplorable, absolutely deplorable. The conditions that lead to these high rates of incarceration, of drug abuse, of violence, all of this shit is happening at a systemic level. And yes, the government of Canada is responsible for not following through on the recommendations put forth by its own investigation. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who has made reconciliation with Indigenous peoples a priority for his government, thanked that those heard stories, and the Commission has vowed to enact inquiry's recommendations. This is an uncomfortable day for Canada, but is an essential day. Justin Trudeau has eventually admitted that this is a genocide, as have multiple people. It's not just, by the way, the government of Canada, okay? The Human Rights Division of the United Nations is now the second international body to call for a deeper examination to the conclusion from the National Inquiry into the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. The Canada is committed ongoing is the key word, colonial genocide against Indigenous peoples. In a statement on Monday, the UN Human Rights Office said the inquiry uncovered reasons to believe Canada's past and present, this is a fucking key part, and present, Canada's past and present policies, actions, and failure to act towards Indigenous people amount to genocide under international law. This is not just coming from some fucking jabroni on the internet trying to cause and do virtue signaling. This is something, again, that international bodies who observe this kind of shit have been asking for on a recent basis. We call on the government to take steps to complete national authorities to assess these serious claims. The statement came as the office's top representative, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, visited Ottawa to meet Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and take part in a panel discussion on the rights around the world with Foreign Affairs Minister Christina Freeland. Speaking briefly to reporters on the panel, Bachelet said that she was aware of the inquiry's finding on genocide, but emphasized that it is more important for Canada to consider the inquiry's 231 recommendations to help victims of violence and prevent more harms against Indigenous women and girls. Again, this is ongoing. This is continuing. Not just me. Amnesty International is calling for the same thing. Amnesty International has recognized that there's a genocide, an ongoing genocide in Canada. Indigenous women in Canada continue to be coercively or forcibly sterilized. Canadian and international media are reporting on the ongoing practice of coerced or forced sterilizations of Indigenous women in Canada. Forced sterilization is when a person is sterilized without their knowledge or informed consent. Sterilizations under coercion is when people give their consent for the procedure, but on the basis of incorrect information, i.e. women being told the procedure is reversible, or other coercive tactics such as intimidation, or the conditions are attached to sterilization, such as financial incentives to access health services. Forced and coerced sterilization is a form of gender-based violence and torture. Forced and coerced sterilizations of Indigenous women in Canada is the product of systemic discrimination and has been documented from the 1800s to present. In the 1970s, there were about 1,200 cases of coerced sterilization of Indigenous women reported intended to reduce the number of Indigenous persons in Canada. 100% eugenics, and this is continuing to this day. It was 2008, not decades ago, 2008, when a class action lawsuit was launched in Saskatchewan because multiple women came forward to say that they are still undergoing coerced sterilization. And it is being done legally by saying that these women have mental disabilities or are mentally deficient. That is how they are justifying this. Thank God they're suing them. Indigenous women continue to be coercively or forcibly sterilized. In July 2017, the Saskatoon Regional Health Authority released a report of the external review commissioned by at least 4 Indigenous women in the media that they've been coercively sterilized in Saskatoon hospitals between 2008 and 2012. The report documented experiences of 16 women, most of whom had been coercively sterilized between 2005 and 2010, noted that pervasive structural discrimination and racism in the healthcare system in general, despite attempts to remedy these, remains unmistakable. The pattern of systemic bias against Indigenous peoples in the provision and public services throughout Canada, from the criminal justice system to the healthcare system, is well known and acknowledged by the government. Since publications of the Extension Review in Saskatoon, More Indigenous Women in Saskatchewan, and at least 3 other provinces, including Alberta, Manitoba, and Ontario, have come forward with allegations of forced or coerced sterilization. The number of women coming forward to disclose what has happened to them increases public awareness of this practice. A class action lawsuit was launched in 2017 and represents more than 60 Indigenous women in Saskatchewan, most of whom reported being sterilized for the last 10 to 15 years, and as recently as 2014. They've reported that their consent to be sterilized was obtained during or immediately after the birthing process through coercive means, and in some cases information about other methods of birth control was not provided, or the permanency of tubal litigation was misrepresented. Amnesty International has documented this pattern of the rights and violation in other countries. It has happened in places like Chile, Mexico, notably Peru. The rights have been violated when a person is coercively sterilized. What has the government said about this issue? Amnesty International calls on the Government of Canada to investigate allegations of forced or coerced sterilizations in Canada, with particular attention to cases involving Indigenous women and girls, ensuring justice and reparations to survivors and their families, appoint a special representative to meet with survivors and families to hear the requests of justice and reparations, apply existing criminal litigation and aggravated assault for cases of forced or coerced sterilization, change government policies and practices to exemplify prohibited sterilization without free, full, and informed consent, implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action 23 and 24 on increasing the number of Indigenous healthcare professionals and providing cultural competency training to all healthcare professionals. Again, this is being done by the public healthcare system of Canada, okay? This has either federal or provincial oversight. This is the federal government or the provincial governments of Canada being complicit, yes, complicit in genocide, okay? There is no other way to describe this. I am not being fucking hyperbolic when I describe it this way. Develop a comprehensive national action plan to prevent and address gender-based violence, including federal government, provinces, territories, municipalities, and First Nations. The TRC, in applying cultural genocide, has tried to strike a balance between truth and reconciliation. By adopting a non-legally binding term, it has stayed within its mandate and has been able to cement the approval of survivors while also drawing high-profile allies from the settler mainstream. Its conclusions buttress studies that suggest Aboriginal social and economic problems are the result of systemic long-term racism, ongoing colonialization by white European settlers, and the effects of genocide, which have been included in starvation, massacre, disease, the forced transfer of Aboriginal children through the IRS system, and through other means such as adoption. Here's something else, by the way. Indigenous people are overwhelmingly overrepresented in the criminal justice system of Canada. Now, I know Destiny and Bastiat are on the right side of history when it comes to describing the disproportionate amount of Black people in America represented within the criminal justice system, and exemplifying the fact that that has nothing to do with some kind of intrinsic traits that Black Americans have. The fact that Black Americans are so dramatically overrepresented in the criminal justice system of Canada, the same thing is happening to Indigenous people in this country. And sorry, I meant to say the criminal justice system of America. Indigenous people, in particular women, are more likely to be victims of crime. In 2014, 28% of Indigenous people aged 15 plus reported being victimized in the previous 12 months compared to 18% of non-Indigenous Canadians. The rate of violent victimization among Indigenous people was more than double that of non-Indigenous people. 163 incidents per 1,000 people versus 74 incidents per 1,000 people. Indigenous women had an overall rate of violent victimization that was double that of Indigenous men and close to triple that of non-Indigenous women. The rate of violent victimization of Indigenous women 2014 was 220 times violent incidents per 1,000 people, while the rate for Indigenous men was 110 per 1,000. The rate of violent victimization reported by non-Indigenous women was 81 per 1,000, and non-Indigenous men was 66 per 1,000. Indigenous women reported a sexual assault rate of 115 per 1,000 population, much higher than the rate of 35. That's again 115 versus 35 per 1,000 people. Researchers use the analysis strategies to study particular risks, a factor for victimization when controlling for various various risk factors, Indigenous people are no more at risk of violent victimization than their non-Indigenous counterparts. Rather, the higher rates of victimization observed amongst Indigenous people appear to be related to the increased presence of other risk factors, such as experiencing childhood maltreatment, perceiving social disorders in one's neighborhood, having been homeless, using drugs, or having fair or poor mental health. So again, let's shrink this to what has been happening historically in Canada. We have both the colonization and genocide of Indigenous people. We have the residential school system of Canada. We also have the reserve system in this country, in which we've taken multiple different cultures and ethnicities and squished them into small spaces, and then we've deprived them of so many things, particularly education and water. Yes, water, the ability to drink and live off water. Yes, that is a thing that is happening not 1,000 years ago, today in Canada, that is happening today in this country, because again, this genocide is on fucking going. Because of all these factors, yes, Indigenous people have outrageously high rates of alcoholism, outrageously high rates of drug abuse, outrageously high rates of just physical abuse, mental abuse, sexual abuse. Yes, they are overrepresented in the criminal justice system because, yes, we have a very racist police force that is going to target disproportionately Indigenous people. We have a racist justice system that is going to give them higher sentencing. They are more often than not going to be put in jail as opposed to their white counterparts for the same crimes, the exact same thing that happens to black people in America. It happens to Indigenous people here. Indigenous women overwhelmingly are overrepresented in the criminal system of Canada. Indigenous children, by the way, they make up 5% of the population of Canada. In Canadian jails, they make up 50%. 50%. Like, let that set in. That has nothing to do with the fact that they are intrinsically going to commit crimes more often than the rest of Canadians. 5% of the population, 50% of kids who are in jail. That is overwhelmingly a problem of the system. Speaking of clean drinking water, one of Justin Trudeau's many campaign promises, again, woke Justin Trudeau, was that he was going to clean up the problem in Canadian reserves so that they would have clean drinking water. And yet we live in a problem today. There's over 56 reserves in Canada that do not have drinking water that is palatable by a human. So again, not hundreds of years ago, this is happening today. I'm talking about right now. With 17 months left on the clock, Trudeau's government has nearly halved the amount of long-term advisories, those placed for a year or longer, from 106 down to 56, according to government data. However, the data has limitations. It doesn't include BC or any of the territories. And even then, if Trudeau eliminates long-term boil water advisories by 2021, experts like Martin Hill say he won't have addressed the issues that led to them, nor will it mean that all First Nations people have guaranteed long-term access to clean drinking water. So why, despite the federal government's pledge to do some First Nations still not have potable water? That is exactly what needs to be done to them. I'm still asking that question many years later. 56, they do not have water that is able to be consumed by humans. I don't understand in what world you can live in which that is considered acceptable, and that is not considered part of a long ongoing process of, again, genocide. Canadian government has spent many years and billions of dollars trying to find and make clean drinking water flow to the traps of First Nations. At any given time, some 100 First Nations are under water boil advisories, considering non-profit organizations of the Council of Canadians. This was one of the reasons, by the way, we targeted doing a charity stream to raise the ability to have potable water in First Nations. I'm very, very proud of all of you. We ended up raising $10,000 for that cause. I think it was a really, really good thing. At the same time, this is an ongoing problem, and it's not one that simply throwing money can address, because the problems that lead to the fact that many of these reserves in Canada don't have clean drinking water cannot be addressed by this. And even if that was the case, they have not fulfilled their promise. They are still multiple different First Nations that do not have clean drinking water
from our land. So we have more than a passing need for water. It's a spiritual, cultural relationship that has been interfered with. If the water's doing not well, human beings are going to reflect that.
It's something we take for granted in Canada, access to fresh drinking water at the turn of a tap. But believe it or not, there are some communities in our country that are still without it.
Trudeau promised to eliminate boil water advisories on First Nations reserves within 5 years. By now, you've probably heard of the story of how many First Nations communities across Canada do not have access to safe drinking water. But what you might not know is how this became a reality for so many people living on reserves, and why, after years of efforts and billions of dollars in government spending, people still do not have clean water running from their taps.
Water is the liquid of life.
Let's start with the basics. Water advisories are issued to warn people not to drink their water when it's thought to be unsafe. There are 3 types of water advisories, but boil water advisories are by far the most common. When Prime Minister Justin Trudeau took office, he promised to end long-term boil water advisories by 2021. So not all water advisories, just ones that have been in place for more than a year.
We are still very confident that we are going to be able to end the long-term boil water advisories across Indigenous communities in this country within the...
Yeah, to everyone saying, like, just ignore this. I'm not going to platform him, okay? I'm not putting him back on my streams, especially not after that whole fucking false accusation that I was funding Hamas and getting called out for it. So don't worry about that. But this shit is incredibly fucking important to me. And, like, I want people to know the truth. I don't want them to sit back and be like, well, I saw, you know, someone tweet on Twitter that apparently this whole thing is a fabrication. I want the information to be out there.
In the 5 years we set out.
There were 105 long-term advisories when Trudeau came into office, and right now, according to government data, 56 remain. This data excludes the territories and British Columbia. It also doesn't account for situations where a long-term advisory has been lifted, only to have a new short-term advisory issued within weeks or months. Of the 87 long-term advisories the government says it has lifted to date, 33 of those systems have experienced short-term advisories since. The causes of water advisories varies across the country. Everything from where the water comes from, to the pipes underground, to how remote the community is, can impact how vulnerable it is. For example, facilities relying on surface water, such as a river or a lake, have a higher chance of experiencing water advisories due to the fact that rivers and lakes are more prone to contamination.
We pride ourselves on our high sanitary...
The comparison to how Black Americans are overrepresented in the criminal justice system is directly comparable to how Indigenous people are overrepresented in the Canadian justice system. Like I said, again, Canadian youth make up 5% of the population of this country. They are currently 50% of Canadians, Canadian youth being in the prison justice in the prison system. So. That is not indicative of anything that is inherent or some kind of inherent trait to Indigenous people. It is entirely because of the systems that are put in place. And again, them being raised in these conditions, which will lead to high rates of drug abuse, high rates of crime, all this kind of stuff. Something else that was happening, by the way, the RCMP, again, the enforcers of the federal government of Canada, have been standing by when there was attacks against the Mi'kmaq fishery and the standoff that was going there. 24 hours after it began, it came down to this. Some 30 members of the First Nation protecting a lobster storage space Wednesday suspiciously eyeing 200 non-Indigenous fishermen whose truck lined the narrow road along St. Mary's Bay. As far as the eye could see, the mood was tense, frustration evident. The previous night, somebody had severely damaged the water filtration system in the warehouse and torched a van in the parking lot. In other incidents on Tuesday, the fishermen found themselves trapped in another lobster storage facility nearby West Punico, and a mob of about 200 men gathered, some hurling rocks and racist insults, refusing to disperse when the police arrived. They'd come for the lobsters that the fishermen had caught that day, and when they were finally able to leave the building, the catch was plundered. The chief, Mick Sachs, said that he'd been told that there was a rally of commercial fishermen on Tuesday night, the night before the opening of the local commercial lobster fishery, which includes Indigenous and non-Indigenous fishers, and a portion of the fishers had been left to rally and gone to New Edinburgh and then to Pubnico. Sachs said the frustration early Wednesday is that the RCMP had not taken more action against the members of the mob. I can't believe how they were getting away with these terrorist hate crime acts, and the police were standing there. The incident followed almost 3 weeks of relatively quiet between the non-Indigenous fishermen and the Indigenous fishermen, and at times the violent backlash when the First Nation began its modest livelihood fishery. The Indigenous fishers were conducting a fishery outside of the federally regulated season, pointing to the 1999 Supreme Court Act of Canada decision that ruled East Coast Indigenous groups had the right to fish for a moderate livelihood, though a second ruling stated that this was subject to federal regulation. It's a conflict that is increasingly playing out in the grassroots flare-up between Indigenous and non-Indigenous residents of southern Nova Scotia towns that rely on the fishing industry instead of the roundtables facilitated by the federal department responsible. Non-Indigenous commercial fishermen say the new Indigenous fishery threatens their livelihoods by depleting lobster stock. This was an ongoing crisis that was happening, and you could hear them kicking down doors, bursting the side of the building with rocks. Once the RCMP showed up, I thought we would be able to get out of there, but the RCMP just stood there. Mark said he stayed in the pound, dodging rocks thrown by members of the crowd until he sees the things that calm down, they could leave. The RCMP confirmed that employees by both the Lobster Pound locations, New Edinburgh, and the one in Middle West Pubnico were preventing leaving while disturbances took place. Police say they are now investigating both incidents for the mischief and the threats. The series of incidents, which were they were streamed to Livebook. Assembly of the First Nations and Chief Perry Belgrade of the RCMP said the federal government and the provincial government need to intervene before somebody gets badly injured or killed. Now, this is like another case in point of a lot of problems that I talk about when I bring up that there's systemic issues related to this entire issue. One of the biggest things happens to be like there's numerous cases right now of Indigenous women in public healthcare systems who are being either mocked or they will play games such as doctors within the public healthcare system. And this is under the purview of the provincial governments who are supposed to oversee this behavior, guessing on whether or not they will have high levels of blood alcohol, for example. Or the recent case where the RCMP was investigating a woman whose son had been murdered, and they showed up to her house and they wanted to smell her breath to detect how much alcohol they thought she had consumed. This again was a grieving mother. Now, these are anecdotes, okay? I'm not trying to make a case for like some kind of anecdote Andy when it comes to the systemic problem. I've already pointed out that this problem is so large and vast and again ongoing that it has already been recognized by both the government of Canada themselves, who have done an inquiry into these issues and have made over 200 recommendations, many of which have not been followed through. Until these recommendations are followed through and there's an accordance with the Indigenous people of Canada, then yes, it is completely valid to say that this is an ongoing problem. This is an ongoing genocide, regardless of how you want to label it. Bringing back to this, the coerced sterilization by Indigenous women. Indigenous women in Saskatoon are proposing a class action lawsuit against this province and health regions. They are seeking $7 million in damages. According to the summary of the claim, they experienced coerced sterilization, referring to the practice of sterilizing Aboriginal women in Canada without their proper or informed consent. It says the practice has been going on since the 1930s. These women allege that the province and the country were complicit in the matter. Again, the province and the country set the tone for the institutional systemic racism. The two women who have been named as plaintiffs claim they've suffered physical, emotional, spiritual, mental, and psychological damage. A publication ban has been ordered by the judge to protect their identities. The women are being represented by Lisa Lombard. One of the most significant aspects is how dehumanizing the treatment they say they were subject to and the effects that it can have on a human being's life. To be subject to the treatment and fundamentally remove such a basic voice away from them, which is the choice to have children or not to. Women were asked to consent while in labor. One of the two women in the lawsuit was an Anishinaabe victim of the 60s coup. She was sterilized at the Royal University in 2008 at age 34. 2008, by the way, this is not generations ago, directly having given birth to her youngest son. She was reportedly asked to sign off on tubal litigation while being rushed into surgery after being administered opioids. She was also then was told that the procedure was reversible. She said she has faced a number of physical ailments since the surgery, including symptoms of early menopause, hormonal imbalances, depression. Due to traditional Indigenous belief, she says she considered a woman's ability to reproduce sacred and has never been the same way since it's been taken away from her. The second plaintiff, who identifies as Cree, was sterilized in the same hospital at age 29. She maintains that she did not sign a consent form and was sterilized against her will after giving birth. She said the sterilization has led to the end of her marriage and that she has faced similar physical symptoms after the first complainant. So, going back to the report. And this is one of the most important things. And honestly, if Destiny is watching this, I hope he will take time to talk to his audience about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This was, again, a report that was authorized by Justin Trudeau's government in 2005, the purpose of which was to discover the ongoing and lengths of the genocide that is occurring in Canada. It did find that not only was there a genocide in Canada, that is an ongoing process, and as such made recommendations, again, 200 recommendations in order to try and stop this, in order to try and ameliorate the conditions of the people who are suffering the most under this ongoing genocide. Ongoing genocide. Finally, the last piece I want to talk about is the fact that this all blew up because I used the term cultural genocide when referring to the Uyghur people of China. And many people have taken offense to that, including Destiny, and I'm guessing most of Destiny's fans and people around there. They have taken a lot of offense to me using the term cultural genocide when referring to the Uyghur treatment of the Muslim minority in Xinjiang, China. So,
listen, Destiny, I'm not even saying that I think it isn't horrible for Uyghurs that they have to be forced into vocational training since whatever. Maybe they do experience it as horrible.
You made it sound like
no. Maybe they do experience it as horrible, but that's different from saying there's a genocide going on or they're banning Islam in China. It's just not true.
Well, it's a cultural genocide. So I mean,
how is it a cultural?
So I mean,
it's just not true.
Well, it's a cultural genocide. So
China, it's just not true.
Well, it's a cultural genocide. So I mean,
how is it a cultural genocide?
Because the goal is to erase like the Uyghur culture and to integrate.
No, it's not. It's not. It's not. The Islamic fund.
There you have it. So that's the bow I want to put on this whole thing. Hey, do you like movies? Do you like Serfs? Do you want movies and Serfs watching the movies? So then come over to the new channels. It's the Serfs, the cinema. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. Can you do the thing, that thumbs up and comment and all those things that help us out in the algorithm that controls every aspect of our lives? Also, if you happen to have a Facebook account, can you delete it? Like just delete it. You should probably delete your Facebook account because it's not a great company. But hey, if you can't do that for whatever reason, I understand. And could you also go to facebook.com/thesurftimes then and give us a little like and a follow. We're just trying to push back against the fact that people like Ben Shapiro happen to dominate the platform entirely. And when everyone asks why do older generations believe the things they believe, one of the problems is the majority of them on social media use Facebook. So to counter that, we're just going to be on there too now. Also, if you happen to have a union or a worker co-op or even a leftist project, podcast, website, Zoom, MySpace, it doesn't matter. We will advertise it for free on this channel. All you got to do is go to weareserfs.com and use the forms that we got there, weareserfs.com. Thanks, everybody.
To our gods, Xander Corbis and VK Jehanam, we are prepared to commit human sacrifices for your eternal glory. To our monarchs, the Tim Caucus and Tom Spiker, we are humbled to be your oafish jesters, clowning around in your royal court. To our lords, Evan Nudie, Tofox, Ryan Lubin, Trevor R., Jeff Lamb, and Alexander Thaler, we shall proudly carry your standard onto the battlefield and die for your precious land. To our esteemed Knights of the Round Table, Dark Puppy, Jenna Towell, Anna Loves Riley, Quiet 185, Omni, Riley and Anna, Poodlehawk, Multimondi, Trevor Janis, Lemmy 101, Anthropophojak, Saren 42, Chronic to Hemphog, The Great Pudini, Bone Genie, Catherine, Radical Maniac, Ramona Costa, J. Fraser Cartwright, Jimmy Bignuts, Violent Orchard, Sophie Baby, Andreas Chiringuito, Zach Christensen, Yopi, Josh Mickelson, Todd Buckingham, and Todd Lajeunesse. We raise our glass, we raise our swords, and we salute you.